have that this.
Oh, yes.
Mic on. Mic on.
Mic test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2 3. Mic test 1 2.
The words aren't.
Test 1 2 3. Mic test 1 2.
Ready?
Mic test 1 2.
Mic on. Mic on, mic on, mic on. Mic on, mic on. Mic on.
Committee will come to order, and pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 4 measures. They're all bipartisan, and without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit any statements or any extraneous material into the record. I think everyone was notified yesterday we intend to consider today's measures en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. H.R. 5040, the Export Control Reform Act, Royce Amendment 101 in the nature of a substitute, Sherman Amendment 45. These are all also in your packets, by the way. H.R. 5129, the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act, with Smith Amendment 85. H.R. 5274, the Global Electoral Exchange Act, with the Castro Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5274, and the Titus Amendment 38. And I have H.R. 5480. This is the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, and Royce Amendment 103. And I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. So first, we have the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. This is a bipartisan bill that would replace the outdated Export Administration Act of 1979, which has been in lapse for the last quarter century. And it would replace it with a permanent modern export control authority. So obviously this step is long overdue. Crucially, the bill closes gaps in our export controls that could permit transfers of cutting-edge technology like artificial intelligence and advanced semiconductors to potential adversaries, such as Beijing. It also ensures that transfers of sensitive manufacturing know-how, including through joint ventures, are subject to more rigorous export controls. This act mandates an urgent effort to identify and appropriately control critical emerging technologies that are not currently subject to export controls, but which could be essential to our U.S. national security. And together with CFIUS reforms, this bill will enable the U.S. to remain a leader in innovation, strengthen our industrial base, and protect technologies essential to national security. Next, we consider the bipartisan H.R. 5480. This is the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act. Women in developing countries around the world face binding constraints to entrepreneurship and economic participation. So we have today over 1 billion women that are left out of the formal financial system. And that leaves them without access to savings or credit or insurance or basic property rights. What this legislation does is expands USAID's Micro Enterprise Assistance Authority to include support for small and medium-sized enterprises, which create 4 out of every 5 jobs in emerging markets. When women exert greater influence over household finances, economic outcomes for families improve. Obviously, childhood survival rates go up. Food security and educational attainment are increased. And this isn't just good for local communities in these developing countries. Achieving global gender parity in economic activity could add tens of trillions of dollars to annual GDP growth around the planet by 2025. This helps us. Next, we have Chairman Smith's H.R. 5129. This is the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act of 2018. Last Congress, we came together in a bipartisan way to enact the Global Food Security Act. Since enactment in 2016, the Global Food Security Strategy has helped 11 million small farmers gain access to new technologies. It has unlocked $2.7 billion in loans, $830 million in direct private sector investment. And it's reduced poverty by an average of 19% in the focus areas. These programs have also allowed us to reach 27 million children under the age of 5 with vital nutrition assistance. And we did this without increasing spending. H.R. 5129 continues this good work by extending the existing authorization for an additional 2 years. Finally, I want to thank Representatives Castro and Meadows for introducing H.R. 5274. This is the Global Electoral Exchange Act. Healthy societies depend on elections that accurately reflect the decision of voters. The world has a shared stake in the integrity of election mechanisms. The nuts and bolts of how people cast their votes and how these votes are counted, free from manipulation, is the subject here. And this bill would strengthen this work by authorizing the Secretary of State to run exchanges to better equip those who organize and administer elections in their home countries. And I now recognize the ranking member for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for calling this markup. We have 4 good measures before us today, and I'm happy to support them all. And as always, I want to thank all of our members on both sides of the aisle for their hard work. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for putting forward the Export Control Reform Act. As you mentioned, it's been almost 4 decades since the law on export controls was revised. The old law is filled with out-of-date provisions that simply don't reflect our current national security priorities. It also expired in 2001. So for the last 17 years, the legal authority for regulating sensitive exports has been based on emergency authority contained in executive orders. That's why this bill is so essential. It updates the export control system to reflect today's reality of the way these technologies are developed and transferred in global trade. It provides a new approach to help mitigate the risks of sensitive technologies falling into the hands of our adversaries, and it reasserts the role of Congress in addressing the important national security priority. I'm proud to be the lead Democratic co-sponsor of this legislation, and I urge all members to support it. Next, I want to turn to the Global Food Safety Reauthorization Act. This is another great example of bipartisan, common-sense cooperation on vital foreign policy issues. I'm an original co-sponsor, and I'm pleased to see this bill on the agenda. Nearly 800 million people around the world live without the certainty that their families will have enough to eat. Underfed populations are less productive and more vulnerable to disease. Without reliable access to food, it is much harder for a country to achieve stability and prosperity. So we have an interest and a moral obligation in tackling this problem as part of our foreign policy. This bill reauthorizes the successful Global Food Security Act, which codified the Feed the Future program. We are already seeing some excellent results from this program. A 26% drop in child stunting, 9 million more people are above the poverty line, 1.7 million more families are living without hunger, and $2.6 billion earned by Feed the Future farmers in new agricultural sales. This is a great bill, and I thank the drafters, Representative Chris Smith and Betty McCollum, for their hard work and encourage all my colleagues to support it. Fighting global poverty is a critical issue that our committee faces, and one of the most effective ways we can improve global prosperity is to empower women throughout the world. That brings me to the next measure for today's markup, the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act. This is important. It's a very important piece of legislation, introduced by Chairman Royce and Congresswoman Frankel. It expands U.S. development policy to empower women entrepreneurs in developing countries. Women and girls are powerful, and we know what happens when that power and potential are unleashed. Communities thrive, local and global economies grow, societies prosper and become more inclusive and equitable. If women were full participants in the global economy, we would see an additional $28 trillion in growth in global GDP by the year 2025. Women in developing countries face a series of gender-specific constraints to moving up the economic ladder, including lack of access to financial services. Women-owned small and medium-sized enterprises face almost a $300 billion credit gap. The Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act works to address that disparity by expanding U.S. development assistance to reach those small and medium-sized enterprises. This bill is a welcome step towards improving women's economic prospects, but there remain other barriers to women's economic empowerment, including issues related to maternal and reproductive health. There is a well-documented link between improved access to contraception and women's economic empowerment. Women who are able to plan their families are more likely to receive an education, raise their standards of living, and climb out of poverty. These benefits aren't limited to a woman herself. In homes where parents have the ability to decide the number of children they have, their children tend to be healthier, do better in school, and grow up to earn higher incomes. I'm pleased to be an original co-sponsor of this bill, and I urge all of our members to join me in supporting it, and I hope that we can build upon the good work and address all the barriers that women and girls face so that they can achieve full economic empowerment. And lastly, I turn to the Global Electoral Exchange Act, introduced by Representatives Castro and Meadows, which would establish exchange programs at the State Department that focus on strengthening electoral mechanisms around the world. It is in America's interest that we promote credible elections, and having exchange programs to share best election practices is an excellent idea. We should be doing all that we can be doing to promote democracy. I support this bill along with the other measures we're considering today, and I again thank all our members on both sides, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Chris Smith, the author of the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Engel, for your strong support for this as well. Both of you are co-sponsors, as is Betty McCollum, who is the principal Democrat co-sponsor, and my good friend and colleague, Karen Bass, who is also one of the leading original sponsors as well. Thank you. This is bipartisan legislation that has worked, and this is the reauthorization to continue and hopefully to bring additional emphasis to some of the areas that we have missed in the original enactment of this landmark legislation. I'd remind my colleagues that there are 800 million hungry people in the world today. Not only do children still die from malnutrition, we know that because of malnutrition, those children are subjected to other sicknesses, opportunistic infections. Malaria takes a even more devastating toll on them because of their malnutrition. Feed the Future, this legislation and the underlying program, which began in the Bush administration, was strengthened and expanded in the Obama administration and has now been continued and strengthened under the leadership of President Trump. Continues to reach out to the most vulnerable. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, we've seen a significant drop in poverty, some 19%. And the drop in child stunting, and as I travel throughout the world, particularly in Africa and places like Guatemala, which has had a huge stunting problem, they have joined the effort to provide nutrition to young people, especially mothers and mothers carrying children. Stunting has dropped significantly, and why is stunting so bad? Obviously, the impact it has on the individual, their diminished capabilities intellectually and the like. If the food and nutrition is there, especially in the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday, and then hopefully, God willing, it continues, we have stronger, more resilient children, and then young adults, and then adults to live out a life that is far more fruitful than when they're carrying a number of sicknesses. This authorization bill emphasizes the importance of deworming initiatives. Among the neglected tropical diseases, intestinal worms account for nearly 80% of neglected tropical disease prevalence, affecting close to 1 billion people the world over. These worms undercut our nutrition interventions and can lead to death by malnutrition or lifelong stunting as well. We need to combine our nutrition interventions not only with coordinated deworming campaigns, but also with water sanitation health interventions that change people's behavior. WASH training helps ensure people limit exposure to worms, such as by washing and peeling vegetables, or something as simple as giving children shoes to wear if they walk on worm-infected soil so that they don't get sick again. So this, I will ask Yam's consent to my full statement made a part of the record, but this legislation, I think, will save many lives, and I thank you again for bringing it to the committee today.
We go now to Mr. Davis Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and to the ranking member for holding this markup today of these bipartisan measures. As always, I appreciate the way our committee works together across the aisle to move important reforms and authorizations. I'm pleased to support H.R. 5129, the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act, which will extend Feed the Future until 2021, ensuring that the United States government remains at the forefront of fighting global hunger by providing assistance to millions of hungry and vulnerable people around the world in order to build sustainable food systems, improve resilience, expand agricultural markets, and improve nutrition for local communities. The Feed the Future program has had a remarkable success, as outlined in the 2016 progress report, showing statistically significant declines in poverty in 11 out of 17 focus countries. I'm also pleased to join with my colleagues Congressman Smith and Congresswoman McCollum, as well as the chair and ranking member as a co-sponsor of this important legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I'm also pleased to support H.R. 5480, the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, introduced by Chairman Royce and Congresswoman Frankel. Though the United States already does a lot of incredible work to support the empowerment of women and girls around the world, this legislation would expand programs to ensure that all USAID projects and activities are shaped by a gender analysis, and gender equality and female empowerment is integrated throughout the agency's program cycle. This bill will expand USAID's microenterprise development assistance to include small and medium enterprises, particularly those owned, controlled, and managed by women, and will institute reporting requirements so that we can track the implementation of this bill. I strongly support these efforts and thank my colleagues for their work on behalf of women and girls. And finally, I'm pleased to support H.R. 5274, the Global Electoral Exchange Act, introduced by my friend and colleague Congressman Castro. This smart legislation will create an exchange program for election officials in order to exchange best practices between the United States and other countries. At a time when democratic systems are under attack across the globe, this legislation will help educate education officials on best practices for administering an election. I'm also a proud co-sponsor of this legislation and urge my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you again to all of my colleagues for working on these important pieces of legislation, and thank you again to you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this markup today. And with that, I yield back.
We go now to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It has been a long time since Congress has been able to reform some of our outdated laws. The Chairman and Ranking Member's Export Control Reform Act is a much-needed update to the old Export Administration Act of 1979. And while I do applaud this measure, as well as your efforts to reestablish strong congressional oversight of export controls, I do wish that we had moved away from the current rescission process. The bill allows for a rescission of a country's designation as a state sponsor of terror, SST, to continue to operate under the current mechanism. This allows for the administration, any administration, to remove a country from the SST list, and only by passing a joint resolution of disapproval can Congress block this decision, meaning we need a veto-proof majority. Very difficult to do. And I look back at the most recent decisions that removed SST countries, Cuba and North Korea, and think that Congress was really powerless to prevent these moves. We are missing an opportunity here and are again allowing the administration too much leeway. We have seen that some administrations will bargain an SST designation for next to nothing, and will have little to prevent that. I'm dismayed that we aren't giving ourselves the proper oversight over SST designations, and I hope, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, that we can find a way to modify this mechanism going forward. I'd also like to express my strong support for my colleague Chris Smith's bill, the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act. With nearly 800 million hungry people worldwide, addressing the challenge of food insecurity is both a moral and national security imperative. Hunger is a leading factor driving so much of the instability and violence that we see in the world today. And by investing in stronger food systems, we can help develop more resilient communities that are able to withstand these pressures. We need proper oversight and a strategy that makes sure USAID and its partners are fully integrated in achieving U.S. interests. This bill ensures that strategy remains in place, and I offer the bill my strong support. Congrats, Mr. Smith. I also want to speak in support of my friend Joaquin Castro's Global Electoral Exchange Act. At a time when bad actors such as Russia have been proven to meddle in our nation's election, including our own, in other nations' elections, including our own, it is more important now than ever that we do what we can to ensure the validity and security of our electoral process. This bill is a tool that we can use to not only advance and protect our interests by ensuring that outside actors cannot work to manipulate election results, but it also serves to advance our democratic ideals. I do want to note that elections alone do not a democracy make. We saw that last month in my native homeland of Cuba with the sham selections. Really, there were no elections set up by the Castro regime, and we're set to see the same fraud taking place in Venezuela next month with Maduro's sham snap elections. And with this farce of a transition of power set to happen tomorrow in Cuba, this bill serves to remind us that the people of Cuba are still denied their God-given rights. Until there are free, fair, and transparent elections in Cuba, in Venezuela, or anywhere in the world, we need to continue to support the people whose rights are being denied, which is why initiatives such as this one are so important in promoting sound election practices around the world. And finally, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I elevated you or demoted you, I'm not sure. I also support your bill with Ranking Member Engel, the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act. Sadly, women continue to face insurmountable barriers that deter their availability to becoming full and equal members of society. This bill seeks to update USAID policy to chip away at those barriers, improve women's working environments, support their property rights, and aid them in providing access to greater economic opportunity. It is our responsibility to empower women, and this bill does so through our USAID programs. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for a fine set of initiatives that we can all support.
Well,
Thank you.
I thank the Chairman Emeritus, and I recognize her for her longstanding support for strengthening congressional oversight over U.S. foreign policy and for combating terrorism. I would make a few points on the Export Controls Reform Act where it does move in the direction that you want to see, maybe not as robustly as you wanted to see it, but what it does do is it strengthens the congressional oversight over the delisting of a state sponsor of terrorism, and it does that really by quadrupling the time, by fourfold, that a designated country has got to refrain from sponsoring terrorism before being delisted. So it's no longer 6 months, it's 24 months. And I think this gives us a chance for much better evidence that a country has truly abandoned terrorism. But it also doubles the time that Congress has to review the proposed removal of the country from the list. So it goes from 45 days to 90 days, and that improves our oversight. And it, I think, gives us much more time to reject a removal if we find that objectionable. So it helps in that way as well. But one of the changes that I think will work best for us in the committee is that it requires that the administration notify and brief Congress at the front end when they initiate a review of a designated country's potential removal from the list. So I think all of that puts us in a better position than we are now. And I did want to share that with you. I understand your.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Lois Frankel from Florida, the co-sponsor of our Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act.
Thank you, Mr. Rice and Mr. Engel, for your extraordinary bipartisan leadership. And I want to thank my colleagues for their good work on all these bills, which I support. I want to specifically focus my remarks on the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, which I am honored to be one of the original co-sponsors. The bill recognizes that when women around the world are educated and have access to the tools for economic success, their communities are safer, stronger, and more peaceful, and so is the world. Living in the United States, where there's so much opportunity, is hard to comprehend the hardships and obstacles that girls and women face in so many parts of the world. I think of Fatim, a young girl born in Mali. At just 8 months, she may be cut, subjected to genital mutilation. By age 12, her father may sell her for marriage. to a man she's never met. Or Nasha, a young woman in Nigeria desperate for an education who has to walk miles, fearful of sexual violence or kidnapping just to get to school. Or Camellia, a grown woman in Pakistan who dreams of starting her own business and being able to care for her family, but discriminatory laws prohibit her from owning property or being able to access credit. She is among the 1 billion women excluded from the formal financial system. And millions of young girls face child marriage, sexual assault, human trafficking, genital mutilation, femicide. I could go on. 1 in 3 suffer gender-based violence. Access to health care and education is limited. Laws in their countries restrict their employment, property rights, access to credit, and other financial resources. So it is not surprising that women and girls are the majority of the world's poor. Now here's the thing. Because of too many cruel and unfair practices against girls and women, the world is poorer too. According to McKinsey Global Institute, a leading international private sector think tank, if we change this equation and advance women's equality, we could add $28 trillion to the global GDP in just 7 years. And there is an undeniable link between women's economic success and global prosperity, and this excellent bill makes it a U.S. development policy to reduce gender disparities related to economic opportunity, to strive to eliminate gender-based violence, to support women's property rights, and increase the capability of women and girls to determine their own future. The bill requires that 50% of USAID's resources for small and medium-sized enterprises be targeted to reach enterprises owned and managed and controlled by women. It codifies USAID's practice of shaping policy and activities through a gender analysis, which should examine gender differences in access to resources and opportunities, different impacts of policy and programs on men and women, and provide recommendations to narrow the gender gaps and improve the lives of women and girls, and to ensure that our development assistance is reaching women. This legislation mandates that USAID track and measure improvements in women economic empowerment, including employment, access to financial services, enterprise development, earnings and control over income, and property and land rights. In addition, this legislation expands the scope of development assistance for micro enterprises to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to reflect the change in the field. Investing in women's empowerment is not only humane, it's good common sense, because when women exert greater influence over household finances, economic outcomes for families improve, childhood survival rates increase, food security and educational attainment also increase. Women also tend to place a greater emphasis on household savings, which improves families' financial resiliency. When girls and women do better, their nations do better. Women are potent forces for peace and prosperity. When they succeed, the world will succeed. I thank my colleagues for joining me in support of this important bill. And I yield back.
Thank you. We now go to Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Elliot Engel for their bipartisan efforts to bring the Export Control Reform Act before the committee. This bill helps protect industry and commerce in the United States by preventing technological theft while reducing the risk of other countries misusing controlled items and technologies for nefarious purposes. Importantly, this bill would replace the Export Administration Act, which lapsed in 2001. While export controls have been maintained through emergency powers granted to the President, this legislation would update and strengthen our export controls to maintain the pace for modern international and digital trade without harming trade. Foreign investment in the United States creates economic opportunity, but it also has created gaps in our technological security. Currently, foreign-owned companies in the United States often do not need a license to receive dual-use technology normally subject to such controls when exported abroad. This bill corrects and updates this flaw for the modern era. This legislation also would adapt to the advances in technology by mandating an interagency process to identify emerging technologies that need to be protected by export controls, which will allow export controls to stay up to date. This bill protects American technology from theft and abuse and ensures that our export control system remains robust and effective. I am grateful to support and co-sponsor the H.R. 5040, the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, and urge its passage. Additionally, as a former election observer for the International Republican Institute to Bulgaria, and as a host for election observation by Ambassador Peter Burian of Slovakia during the Republican primary for president, I especially appreciate the Global Electoral Exchange Act by Congressman Joaquin Castro and urge its passage. I yield back.
We go now to the author of the Global Electoral Exchange Act, Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for bringing these measures before us today and for your leadership on this committee. I want to say thank you to all the members whose bills are before us today for your hard work. The bills considered today, including the Export Control Reform Act, Global Food Security Reauthorization Act, and Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, address important issues in the world, and I'm pleased to support all of them. Included in this package is a bill I authored with Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina before the committee today, the Global Electoral Exchange Act, or H.R. 5274. In the last decade, we've seen democracies around the world in retreat, including some in our own backyard. This is in contrast to prior years. In countries around the world, democracy activists and well-intentioned leaders strive to create more inclusive societies but face significant challenges, including lack of institutional knowledge of electoral processes. An election is a complex endeavor and an exercise a society undertakes together. It requires an engaged public, robust institutions, and a transparent, technically sound electoral mechanism. Such an electoral mechanism must include a secret ballot, inclusive voting systems, chain of custody, neutral instructions to voters, and so much more of what may be considered good electoral practices. When these electoral mechanisms are inadequately transparent or technically unsound, the legitimacy of an election and its results are in question. We saw this firsthand in Kenya and Honduras over the last year, where electoral failure led to election violence and a questionable outcome. The State Department and USAID already engage in excellent work in partnership with groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, and International Foundation for Electoral Systems, supporting democracy worldwide. This bill would establish exchange programs with other countries administered by the State Department for individuals involved in the conduct of elections. When we bring folks over here to show them how we do things and send Americans to other countries to see how elections are conducted overseas, we can have candid conversations on how all of us can improve these processes. These educational programs would benefit both societies abroad, keen on democratizing, and our own states and cities right here in the United States. I'd like to thank again my co-author, Mark Meadows. I believe he's at he's at a OGR hearing and can't be here right now. But he and his staff put in a lot of work also, and I'd like to say thank you and ask for my colleagues' support on this.
Thank you. We go now to Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Engel, I want to thank you for holding today's markup, and especially thank you and the other members of this committee for your work to advance H.R. 5480, the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act. And I say that as a father of 4 daughters. Women make up approximately 40% of the world's workforce, yet are restricted from contributing to their economics due to economic barriers, such as access to credit and other financial services. Due to this, less women are able to start or grow their own businesses. Research suggests that leveling the financial playing field for women could result in $28 trillion to the annual GDP by 2025. And that is why I'd like to offer my strong support for this bill, This legislation will empower women's entrepreneurship by expanding U.S. assistance to women-owned and managed small and medium-sized enterprises. I believe that a world in which women have access to the same economic opportunities as men is a world that will be more prosperous and more stable. So I encourage my colleagues to support the passage of this measure, and I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Dina Titus of Nevada.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I too support all of these bills and think they're excellent pieces of legislation and appreciate the work that their sponsors have done to bring them to this point. I'd like to speak specifically, though, about the Global Electoral Exchange Act and salute Congressman Castro and Meadows for introducing this bill. I'm a co-sponsor of it, and I appreciate also the chairman including my amendment en bloc today. The Global Electoral Exchange Act will help promote best election practices through a global electoral exchange program to foster the growth of democracy around the world. As a member of the House Democracy Partnership, which works with developing democracies to strengthen their institutions, I can attest to the importance of strong electoral processes in bolstering democracy and promoting economic development. But according to the World Health Organization, roughly 15% of the Earth's population has a disability, and 80% of those persons live in developing countries. Inclusion of persons with disabilities is a fundamental part of democracy, and this must extend to the electoral process as well. Unfortunately, barriers continue to exist around the world that limit these folks to their full and effective participation in elections. So therefore, they aren't able to enjoy aspects of life and fulfill their potential. My amendment would ensure that the best practices shared through this program would also include those related to equitable access to polling places, voter education information, and voting mechanisms for persons with disabilities. By recognizing this need, the U.S. is continuing its role as a leader in disability accommodation in all aspects of life here at home and around the world. And I thank you and yield back.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you bringing up these important pieces of legislation, and I support them all, and I want to give a strong support for the Export Control Reform Act. I support this legislation completely, and I'd like to see in the future expand to cover other forms of research, including biotech, including plant, animal, and medicine. These are also vital to national security, and I look forward to offering amendments in the Rules Committee and also on the House floor when this bill comes up for a vote on its way to becoming law. And also to give a shout out for H.R. 430, the State Sponsor of Terrorism Review and Enhancement Act, that a lot of the portions of that are in the Export Control Reform Act. And I look forward to that piece of legislation coming up also, and I yield back.
We'll look forward to working with the gentleman on biotech and some of these other considerations that should be included. Mr. Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm glad we have these these bills here today. I'm proud to support all of them.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Any further members seeking recognition? Mr. Tom Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I would echo the sentiments of our colleagues on each side of the aisle. Proud of each of these four pieces of legislation, very briefly and specifically. On H.R. 5480, I would commend yourself, Ranking Member Engel, Member Frankel. Member Engel said, and I will adopt fully his comments, that these actions to empower women economically will, quote, help communities thrive, help economies grow, help opportunity expand. I wholeheartedly agree, and I would add, they will also help reduce radicalization, expand hope, which stymies extremist recruitment, and will foster a more tolerant and open society across the globe. Such a good bill. In other words, this act helps not only women across the globe, but people everywhere. And Mr. Chairman, I would argue it will save many uncountable lives. Also on H.R. 5040, the Export Control and Reform Act, I commend the chair and ranking member on their ability to determine sort of a glaring problem that had been delayed in being addressed for decades. This is a good bipartisan and overdue reform. Just as Mr. Yoho referenced hopes that we talk more about biotech, et cetera, I understand this might not be the committee of purview, but I hope that this legislation will embolden us to address the glaring EB-5 visa situation, which essentially are sold and allow 4 out of 5 of these to go to Chinese, which once they're here allows them nearly unlimited access to sensitive technology. Again, I commend the ranking member, the chair, and the committee as a whole for advancing these common sense and good bipartisan initiatives. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. And I think you raise a point there, and we should confer with Judiciary, with Mr. Goodlatte on that issue. Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for working with me on an amendment to H.R. 5040, which is the Export Control Reform Act. I think the bill's excellent. I think the amendment makes it better. This amendment will ensure that the Department of Commerce, which licenses the exports of dual-use items, explicitly gathers information and takes into consideration whether a major export of controlled equipment or technology will have a negative impact on the production of items that are needed for our own national security here in the United States. So much of export control is we look at a particular weapon system and say, should that country be trusted with that weapon system? But what is just as important is that we control the export of manufacturing equipment and technology. We export far less than any other major country as a percentage of our GDP. When an American firm sends technology and the ability to produce critical items outside the United States, we could call that as one small export, but it has a negative impact on our national security industrial base and our high-tech workforce. Even when we're exporting this material to an ally, what we're doing is making that ally the country that will do the manufacturing using our technology. Well, that may not be good for jobs in our economy, but this is not a pair of shoes. This is not a television set. This is, when we export jobs and industrial base in the military sector, in the dual-use sector, we undermine our ability to produce what our military needs should the case arise. Having a robust toy-making industry might be good for the United States. Having a robust industry in the area of weapons systems is critical for our national security. Not only that, but by transferring this technology and industrial capacity, we create a circumstance where some other country will determine whether the produce of that industry, whether the weapon systems that are manufactured or the dual-use items that are manufactured will be exported to this or that additional country. Right now, when weapon systems and dual-use items are exported, it comes to not only administration of this country, but often comes to this committee. But if we export the manufacturing capacity, the government of Italy or the government of Japan is not going to be submitting reports to the United States Congress, giving us 60 or 90 days to approve or disapprove of arms or dual capacity material export. So I think that it is important that we look at the industrial base as part of our national security infrastructure. I want to take this moment also to voice my support for the other bills that are before us. I particularly want to associate with myself with the comments of Ms. Frankel from Florida and her excellent work on the Women's and Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, and associate myself with Mr. Castro from Texas's comments on the importance of Global Electoral Exchange Act, and commend him for his work on that. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for working with me on this amendment, including in the unblocked package, and I urge support of the motion.
Thank you. I think Mr. Sherman puts his finger heart of the matter here, because the question is no longer, can it be the export of individual systems on dual use? It has to be the export of the know-how. And your point about making certain we have re-export controls so that if we transfer it to an ally, they cannot transfer, is equally applicable to the question of making certain that the know-how itself is not transferred in all the ways we tried to do that in this measure. And as we move forward, I just wanted to thank Mr. Sherman for his contributions to this overhaul. It's been a long time coming, and I think our efforts here are to identify every one of these examples from past mistakes and figure out how we close those loopholes, especially given the new technologies that are coming. We go now, do any other members seek recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. And without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended, and staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. And that concludes our business for today, and I want to thank Ranking Member Engel and all of our committee members for their contributions and their assistance with this markup today. The committee stands adjourned.